Sure. Shall we?
And why not?
Why not? All right. Well, welcome everyone to the China Seminar Series hosted by the Australian Centre of China and the World at the Australian National University. My name is Matthew Galway. I'm a Senior Lecturer of Chinese History here at the ANU, and it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Benjamin Penny, Professor Benjamin Penny. Before I introduce him, I'll just begin with an acknowledgement that we are on the First Nations lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and on who these unceded lands, traditional lands, we meet and pay our respects to the elders past and present. So a little bit about our speaker today. Professor Benjamin Penny is an institution at the ANU, specifically at the CIW, professor of Chinese history and religion in the School of Culture, History, and Language, and head of the ANU Taiwan Studies program. And his most recent books include A Young Englishman in Victorian Hong Kong, The Diaries of Chaloner Alabaster, 1855-1856. Other projects that he's working on include studies of Taiwanese new religions, 19th century Bible translation, and Song Dynasty Taoist text history. And today we get the pleasure and indeed the privilege to listen to a great talk that he's going to give us on Yeming Chen. So without further ado, Professor Benjamin Penny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and those who are online. Thank you also. So this is this paper concerns apparently a small topic, that is the death of the important late Qing official, Yeming Chen. Yeming Chen, who in English language texts of the time, mid-19th century, is usually called Commissioner Ye, was arguably the third most important official in China in his time. And at the height of his career, just before he died, he was the Governor General, this is him here, this is Yeming Chen. He was the Governor General of what was called the Liangguang, the two Guang provinces, that is Guangdong and Guangxi, in the south of China. This was a very, very important position, partly because it was also the official, this is before the so-called Foreign Affairs Organization of the Qing Dynasty was established. And the governor of the Liangguang was the person to whom Foreign Affairs was delegated. So he's the guy, when he had this position, that he was the one who communicated with essentially the British governors in Hong Kong and other colonial powers. For many years, when he was in office, he was regarded by the British as a terrible man, recalcitrant, obstructionist, and uncooperative. So to bring it down to specific times, in October 1856, and this is 13 years after the Treaty of Nanjing, when the British were ceded the island of Hong Kong, there had been lots of little disputes about the implementation of the Treaty of Nanjing and subsequent treaties made with the French and the Americans afterwards. And there was an incident, which is known these days as the Arrow incident, that occurred that sparked military action on the part of the British and French. The Arrow was a boat. It was what was known at the time as a launcher, which was a boat with a Western-style hull and Chinese-style sails. Not very big. And these launchers were typically crewed by Chinese people, but captained and flagged by the British. So they were officially British boats, and they had the Union Jack on them, or whatever was the appropriate flag at the time, but the Chinese were doing most of the work on them. Anyway, the Arrow was captured by the Chinese police forces equivalent, and the crew were taken away, and much to the chagrin of the British, the British flag was pulled down. This is what apparently caused great offence. Most historians these days, or at least many of them, regard the Arrow's capture and the forcible lowering of the flag to have been used by the British as an excuse to begin military action. They wanted military action, and this was their excuse. So in late October 56, this is a few weeks after the Arrow was captured, the British go up the river in their ships and bombard Canton City, which was a walled city. They bombard the city, and periodically until January of the following year, they also attack Chinese war junks on the river, and American seamen go through the wall where the cannons have made a hole in the wall, and they go into the inner part of Canton City, which had been previously not allowed for them to do. The British go back to Hong Kong. Over the next year, the British are somewhat distracted by the fact that they had an election in April of that year, in which the actions surrounding the Arrow were actually one of the issues, and also, probably more importantly, the Indian Mutiny occurred. So it wasn't until later in the year when, with French now, who also had taken up the cause, they attack Canton again. So they go up the river with their boats with guns on them, and they attack Canton from December of 1857. The city itself was captured on the 1st of January 1858. That is, all the British and American and French troops go into the city, occupy the city. 1 week later, Ye Ming-chen, who was governor of Liangguan, as I said, his office was in Canton, he was captured. So Ye Ming-chen is captured, and he's taken to a boat on the river, a Navy boat called the Inflexible, and he was kept on the boat essentially as a prisoner in Hong Kong harbour. They went back to Hong Kong. He stayed on the boat. Apparently kept rather nicely. Lots of people came to visit him. He was all chatty. He was a prisoner. And about a month later, a little after that, in late February, the British decided that him being in and around Canton was too much of a risk as a kind of political figurehead people could gather around. So they moved him, and they shipped him off to Calcutta in India, which was a very much comparatively large and well-established British city compared with Hong Kong at the time. So he ends up in Hong Kong, he ends up in Calcutta, along with a military officer whose name is Lan, who I'm going to call his aide-de-camp, a cook, a barber, and 2 servants. And he was also accompanied by a young Englishman by name Challenor Alabaster. Oh, no, there he is, that's him there. This was much, much later. He was about 20 at the time, Alabaster, that he was Ye's interpreter. So Ye stayed in Calcutta until he died in April 1859, so about 14 months later. Over the subsequent period, there's been considerable speculation about the circumstances of Ye's death. The nature of his death has been a fundamental element in the assertions that he was, on the one hand, a disgraced and unsuccessful official who brought disaster on himself and on China, or on the other hand, that Ye was a noble and remarkable administrator, unjustly criticized essentially by colonialists and their historians for defending his own country's interests. So we've got these 2 competing pictures of what Ye Ming-chen was like. One crucial underpinning of this argument is the assertion that in the Chinese order of things, in the case of military defeat or other disgrace, the presiding official should commit suicide. There are numerous references to this as a general proposition in the Chinese and English language literature. What concerns me here is whether in this case, that is in Ye Ming-chen's case, where he clearly did not commit suicide, what the opinion of Chinese officials was at this time. Now, fortunately, I've been able to discover a document that tells us about this. In early 1858, this is just after Ye Ming-chen is captured, the British consul, well, the British governor in Hong Kong writes to the British consul in Shanghai and says, can you please tell your counterpart, a Chinese official known as the Dao Tai. The Dao Tai was the senior Chinese official in Shanghai. So he says to the consul, can you please tell the Dao Tai that Yemingchen's been captured because he may not know. So the consul then tells his senior interpreter, a guy called J.A.T. Meadows, to go and talk to the Dao Tai and tell him this. And he then reports back, and we have a document where, in Meadows' own handwriting, he's describing the meeting. And what he says is that this Dao Tai, whose name was Wu Xu, he commented, amongst many other things, quote, that Ye Governor General would certainly destroy himself in consequence of having lost Canton to prevent being punished by the emperor. So we can take from this that it was the expectation that someone in Ye's position would normally have committed suicide. So the narrative endorsed by those scholars who maintain that Ye has been unjustly treated by history implicitly endorsed the position of suicide being the obvious thing. They maintain he did not commit suicide when he was captured because he thought he could find a way to England and have an audience with Queen Victoria and be able to convince her that British policy in China should be changed. So this is the story that surrounds Yemingchen. When he found himself in Calcutta instead, allegedly he thought he was going to England. But when he found out he was in Calcutta, saw no hope of his transport any further, he committed suicide then by starving himself to death. So this paper is a somewhat, as part of the kernel of a somewhat larger article I'm writing on this topic. Here I'm going to just give the essentials of the argument, which is my conclusion, which is briefly that on proper investigation of the historical archive, there's actually no evidence for the revisionist narrative that I've just rehearsed, that is that Yemingchen starved himself to death, but that he actually, and unspectacularly, simply died of illness. In addition to re-examining the existing evidence, I've been able to consult a new source that I believe has not so far been discussed, namely the diary from 1859 of Ye's interpreter, Challenor Alabaster. So Alabaster's diaries are held in the archives and rare books room of the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. And I found them a few years ago. The first 4 volumes of that diary come back. Oh, there we are. They formed the basis of this. Here's a recent book I published last year. That book is about the first 4 volumes of the diaries of the time that Challenor Alabaster, aged 16 and 17, was living in Hong Kong. The 4th diary just kind of fizzles out in 1856. We don't have any diaries, at least in that collection, don't know what's happened, don't know if they ever existed, until the beginning of 1859. So these 4 diaries that are in this book were published in just ordinary exercise books. Alabaster just wrote in ordinary books. The one that starts on the 1st of January 59 is in a printed diary, the kind that we get now with 1 page per day that has the date at the top, published by a company that still does diaries called Letts, L-E-T-T-S. They were publishing diaries way back then. So Alabaster starts his diary, the one that I've got, or I've got copies of, after he'd already been in Calcutta with Yemingchen for a number of months, probably 8 to 10 months, something like that. It records his daily activities in Calcutta, his interactions with Yemingchen, Ye's death, and the subsequent arrangements made to deal with his body. It's hard to overestimate the importance of this source for discovering the nature of Ye's death. Alabaster was with him every day. They lived in the same house. And as his interpreter, Alabaster was Ye's means of contact with anybody but the small group accompanying him. The diary hasn't been used in any examination of Yemingchen before. Perhaps it hasn't even been read before. I might be the first person ever to have read this thing since Alabaster wrote it. There are 3 topics related to Yemingchen that the diary illuminates, as noted above. First, the nature of his life in Calcutta. Secondly, his death. And thirdly, the details of the arrangements to deal with his body and its transfer back to China. So the diary reveals that when Ye was not while Ye was not free to leave Calcutta. I mean, he was, after all, officially a prisoner. After an initial period where he was kept in a place called Fort William in Calcutta, which is it's still there, but it's a kind of barracks, I suppose, is the best way to put it. The Calcutta authorities moved him to a two-story building in what was then an outer suburb of Calcutta called Tollygunge, in what looks to be, the records are very dodgy on this, a new development on the grounds of a large temple out in that part of Calcutta. I should say that at this point, the British government in Calcutta also had a lot of other high-ranking prisoners, mostly former Indian kings and rajas who had been defeated in the wars of colonization. And then they moved them to Calcutta to, get them out of the way. And they lived in relative luxury, actually, in various parts of the city. So it wasn't kind of unusual to have ex-leaders living there. They provided, so he was stuck in Calcutta, but they did provide him with a carriage to travel around the city if he wanted to. He didn't want to. He virtually never went out. Alabaster used the carriage, though, until they took it off him and gave him an allowance instead, not long before Ye died, actually. So Alabaster often notes that, in the diaries they are today, he said, I saw Ye, or I saw H.E., His Excellency, or whatever, and, quote, read the papers to him, by which he means that he translated the English language newspapers each day. That is both the papers as they arrived on board ship from England and the papers that were being printed in Calcutta, and there were about at least 3 of them daily, and the papers from Bombay. So Ye was kept up to date with all manner of news. In fact, Alabaster says that no, what are you doing? There we go. This is a page in the diary. Takes a while to get used to his handwriting. But on this page, he notes that he's seeing no one but Herbert and Ye. Herbert was Major Herbert, who was the commandant of the Calcutta Native Militia and the government official that Alabaster reported to. So Herbert was above Alabaster in relation and overall in charge of Ye Mingchen. But despite the fact that he complains that he sees no one but Herbert and Ye, it appears that Ye was actually something of a celebrity. People kept on visiting him to check out this new guy, this famous Chinese commissioner who everybody knew about from the news, who was now a prisoner. Lots of various English do-gooders and people, missionaries, officials, military people coming to visit Ye and have a conversation with him through Alabaster. But also, fascinatingly, one of the visitors, not long before he died, was the pioneering Indian writer and scholar, Rajendra Lal Mitra, who came to see Ye to talk about Buddhism, because he was, after all, the kind of first seriously educated Chinese person in Calcutta for the Indians to talk to. We also know that Ye talked to Alabaster extensively about Buddhism and about Confucianism and about the Chinese examination system. In 2 brief comments in the diary, Alabaster also records conversations about the trade in opium from India, Chinese opium poppy growing, and also the fluctuations of Mexican silver. Those of you who know about currency in the 19th century, Mexican silver was very important. And also about the, quote, relative advantages of military and civil government. Clearly. Alabaster also seems to have gone very well with Lan, the aide-de-camp, who was not quite as young as Alabaster, but much less old than Ye Mingchen. They got on quite well. And Alabaster records talking to Ye about traveling in China, about Chinese dialects, and even took him on a visit to the There we are, to the Asiatic Society. And I'll read you what this says, because I don't expect you to be able to. In the morning with Lan to the Asiatic Society, he much surprised at 2 elephants he saw on the way. Has often seen them at Peking, they forming part of the tribute from Laos. Talked to him about madness, violent madness, the only form known in China. The Chinese too deficient in imagination to ever suffer from mental delusion, he says. Very odd thing to say. Showed him the museum and some books of plates, which he said, Dakai, and opened his eyes, and so went home. Alabaster also asked Lan about the secret of Ye's, quote, success in life. Lan apparently replied that it was because, and this would have surprised many English people, because Ye, quote, never made an enemy. There's only one record of Ye Mingchen leaving the house in this diary. And that occurred after Lan, this aide-de-camp, had died of cholera. Lots of people in Calcutta at this time died of cholera. It was very, very common. And he died on the 23rd of February of this year. And Alabaster records today's events in this way. What am I doing? Would you be able to?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So on the 23rd of February, that's it. Alabaster, this is the page of the diary. Alabaster says, read the papers to Ye and elicited his views on Sunday closing and play-going generally. Also in the evening, had some talk as to poor Lan's future, Lan having died. Ye deciding that he is a Gui, the ghost. So Lan, Ye Mingchen is, discussing his post-mortem existence. He, His Excellency, went today to burn incense at the poor fellow's tomb, and they, meaning here Ye's servants, made offerings in his room at night. They are, however, still afraid to go back to it, though ridiculed for this affectation by Ye. Okay, so this is Ye's life in Calcutta. Moving on to his death. The death is the crux of this paper, so I'm going to give the entries in full. The first intimation we get of Ye's ill health is on the 6th of April, 1859, when Alabaster writes, lifted to Watson's for arrowroot and sago for Ye. Now, Watson's was a big shop, essentially, in the middle of Calcutta, sold everything. Arrowroot and sago to, what are they? Grains, whatever. They were made, at this time, they were thought to be, they were made into a kind of soup as a kind of nutritious thing for sick people to eat, a bit like chicken soup or something these days in some cultures. So presumably he wasn't well on the 6th of April, but Alabaster's not concerned that he's going to die. It's just he's feeling a bit poorly. 2 days later, do you want to see where we're up to? You can leave that up there, it won't come, it's not. 2 days later, he wrote, Dr. Payne worked in the Calcutta Hospital, called to see His Excellency at 7 a.m., 2 p.m. and 8 p.m., the third time accompanied by Dr. Scriver, who's also one of the doctors at the hospital. His Excellency very weak all day and able to take very little nourishment, but better towards evening. Dryburgh, who was a missionary, came over at about 6 and saw His Excellency, wrote to Mr. Bruce, that's the secretary of the governor of India, on Ye's sickness. Sorry, Bruce was the governor of Hong Kong, wrote about Ye's sickness, keeping a copy. So Alabaster's keeping everyone informed. This is the entry on the day when Ye died. And as you can see, it says Ye died at the top. I'll read it. Dr. Payne and Major Herbert called and saw His Excellency early in the morning, he appearing much better. Up till 11:30, he appeared to go on improving. At 3, he fell into a slumber, waking at 6 to sink rapidly to death at 8:30. Poor old man. His domestics, that's the servants, much affected, one kowtowing to me when I attempted to comfort him. Doctors Payne and Scriver arrived soon after the death had taken place, 3 hours from my having sent for medical aid. Dryburgh, however, was over from a quarter of an hour from his seizure, but nothing could be done. Wrote off to Bowring, that's another official in India, and Beedon, also Indian official, and in the course of the night officialised Herbert and wrote a note to Beedon on the subject of a post-mortem. Now, we are fortunate not only to have this record of Alabaster, but we actually have the official record of Dr. Payne, the attending doctor, that he wrote the next day to the government of India about his diagnosis and tending of Yare at his death. And Dr. Payne writes that his first visit to Yare was on April the 2nd, so that's 4 days before Alabaster said that he needed this arrowroot and sago. He said, I found that he had suffered for some days loss of appetite, constipation, and other dyspeptic signs, with evidence of some functional derangement of the liver. There was nothing specific in these indications, and I remarked in him a degree of debility far greater than could be explained by them. He retained his usual cheerfulness, however, and was inclined to concur in the opinion which I expressed, that his ailments were due to the increasing heat. So this is April, it's starting to get hotter in Calcutta, everybody's feeling worse because they just do. He appears to have visited again on the 7th of April, perhaps more often than that, and found that, quote, he had so far recovered that I announced my intention of discontinuing my visits. So he got better. The next day, the 8th, he dropped in again, being in the neighbourhood, and found Yare to be suffering, quote, great nausea and occasional vomiting, to be, quote, greatly exhausted and quite unable to move. He had not urinated for 24 hours. These symptoms did not, for Dr. Payne, indicate any specific disease. That afternoon and evening, he visited twice more, as Alabaster tells us, finding on the first visit that the exhaustion had passed off, and one on the second that it had returned in earnest. So he got better, and then he got really exhausted again. He also notes, the remedies ordered for the relief of the retention of urine having proved ineffectual, other means were adopted with success, and His Excellency passed a good night. So they did something to make him piss mechanically, presumably. On the morning of 9th of April, the day of Yare's death, quote, there were appearances of great improvement. Some strength had returned, and he expressed a desire for some nourishment. Note that he expressed a desire for some nourishment. However, by the afternoon, he was vomiting again and was severely exhausted, and he died that evening, as we've seen. So, dealing with his body. The last comment that Dr. Payne makes in his official report concerned his desire to perform a post-mortem examination on Yare's body. He continues, quote, this, however, is prohibited by the strong antipathy felt by the Chinese to its performance. It therefore only remains for me to express my regret that my report is conveyed in shape and terms which I cannot but consider unsatisfactory. On the same day as Payne made his report, Alabaster confirms the purport of Payne's last comment. Major Herbert and Dr. Payne coming to consult me about a post-mortem. I gave my strong opinion against it, and it was accordingly given up. So this was because Chinese people didn't like bodies to be messed with after death at the time for religious reasons. Under these circumstances, there was no possibility of a formal medical determination of the immediate cause of Yare's death. We might note, though, that Alabaster's recommendation against the post-mortem, and the fact that it was accepted by his superiors, as well as the way he says, poor old man, and the fact that he continually refers to him as His Excellency, when he's actually been sacked from that job by the Chinese emperor months before, indicates that Yare was actually treated with a degree of respect, and his death generated pity amongst the people in Calcutta. I should note that the tone of the records, public and private, surrounding his death contrast greatly with the tone of the records of his capture. If you can move on, here's a cartoon of his capture in Canton. And you can see, I mean, he was a grossly obese man, but it's not exactly respectful towards Yare in this picture. Whereas when he dies, the comments are much more respectful. So discussion then turns to the burial of Yare's body. The preferred option was to bury him in the cemetery of what was called the Chinese colony in Calcutta. On the 10th of April, Alabaster saw the head of that colony, who, quote, point blank refused to have anything to do with the funeral. Alabaster expanded on this in a letter he wrote the next day about, this is referring to the head of the Chinese colony. On his arrival, he made great obstacles to burying Ye, declaring it would be impossible to bury His Excellency there in the Chinese cemetery. So disproportionate was his rank to that of those already occupying the ground. So the Chinese people buried there were shopkeepers, peasants, and so on. And here's this great official that it's just completely impossible that he could be buried in the same ground as these minions. Alabaster then reports, he went back to see the head of the Chinese colony that day. And he says, I then again went to the Chinese, who now said they would admit His Excellency into their burial ground on the payment of 2,000 rupees, a demand they steadfastly refused to lower. However, it was also impossible to bury His Excellency agreeable to their usages, it being impossible to prepare a proper coffin in under 3 days. So the decision was taken to return Ye's body to China rather than to bury him in India. The undertaker, and also the clerk of the cathedral, same guy, was called Jenkins Llewellyn, and he took charge of the process of putting Ye into a coffin. And I think you can move on. Yes. Oh no, this is the second one. Mr. Llewellyn accordingly dispatched proper persons to place the body, which had already been prepared by the Chinese for being done so, in one of his patent metallic coffins, and the necessary rites having been performed by his domestics, who entirely acquiesced in the arrangement, if His Excellency was placed in his coffin, draped in his official robes, agreeably to the Chinese usage. So again, they're being very respectful about how they're preparing the body so the Chinese would think it was the right thing to do and so on. Alabaster then went about packing up Ye's things with his remaining servants, made a detailed inventory of all the stuff, and packed it up in boxes for shipment back to Canton. But on the 13th, which is 3 days later, this is what the diary says. In the morning to Mr. Llewellyn's, that's the undertaker, where found His Excellency had burst his coffin twice, but had been as often sold down. It was a metal coffin, so the body had putrefied and gone rotten, and gases had expanded it, and it had burst out of the coffin. It'd been soldered down. It had been burst out of the coffin. It had been soldered down again. Mr. Llewellyn said that there was no fear of his doing this a third time. He was going to solder him down again. But as a precaution, he would put him in a mahogany chest with 6 inches of charcoal, disinfecting fluid, etc., between the two coffins. So take the metal coffin, put it inside a mahogany box with charcoal and other stuff, and then the whole of it to be bound around with iron bars so that it physically couldn't burst, presumably, and covered with gunny bags. Gunny bags are like what we would call a Hessian sack. He would get it on board the boat without delay and direct it to my charge, Alabaster's charge in China. So Alabaster left India with Ye's body and his 2 servants on the boat called the Fiery Cross on April the 28th, arrived at Hong Kong on the 11th. On the 17th, Governor Bruce wrote to Viscount Canning in India to tell him that Ye had arrived, his body and everything had been taken back to Canton. It was all fixed. Okay, so far, and quite understandably, all the reports concerning Ye's death in Calcutta, his illness, his death, and the repatriation have come from English sources, English language sources. He appears not to have had any interaction with the local Chinese community in Calcutta, and probably his only literate Chinese companion was his aide-de-camp, this man called Lan. But Lan, of course, had already died before Ye died. Thus, the first Chinese language source we have concerning these matters dates from August the 7th, 1859, about 4 months later. This is in the form of a supplementary memorial sent by the then provincial governor of Guangdong, a man called Bi Cheng Zhao. And here I would like to thank the Literary and Classical Chinese Reading Group, who ploughed through this memorial with me and made it much clearer to me than it was before. So Bi reports that at the beginning of May, rumours had started to spread in Guangzhou that Ye Mingchen had, quote, died of illness, Binggu, in India. He then notes that on May the 15th, Harry Parkes, who was the British consul in Canton at the time, had sent him a letter that read, and this is my translation of the Chinese translation of Harry Parkes' English letter, so a bit convoluted, but it reads, on the 8th day of the 3rd month of this year, that was the 10th of April, the former Governor-General of the 2 Guang provinces of your illustrious country, Ye Mingchen, died of illness in the capital city of India. After his body had been prepared for burial and encoffined, it was agreed that he be accompanied by the English official Chaloner Alabaster, who had always been in attendance on him and who would vouchsafe his delivery to China. In the evening of the 12th day of the 4th month, that's the 14th of May, he arrived in Yue, Guangdong. On that day, I took the coffin and the money and effects that were left and delivered them all to the Nanhai County office, which is Nanhai County is Guangzhou. All the matters concerning putting the coffin ashore and storing it were dealt with satisfactorily. On receipt of this letter, B says that he made inquiries of the Nanhai County office and ascertained that the local magistrate had in fact taken delivery of the coffin, that they'd moved the coffin to a temple called the Domugong outside the Great East Gate of Guangzhou, that all of his goods and money and stuff had been put in the county treasury and they were all inventoried for safekeeping. And then he says that 2 servants that came back, these were the 2 domestic servants, we don't know what happened to the barber and the cook. It seems they stayed in Calcutta. I don't know. But these 2 servants who returned to China were questioned and made a report. And there's some details about the travel and so on, but here's the important bit. By the 20th day, this is their report, by the 20th day of the 2nd month of the 9th year, that's the 24th of March, 1859, all the foodstuffs we had brought run out. So they'd actually packed a lot of Chinese food on the boat to go to India with. We requested that we might buy food there to replenish our supplies, but the master did not allow it. He said, moreover, quote, the reason I came here and did not kill myself was that at that time I had heard that the barbarians wanted to send me to England. And I had heard that its monarch is always extolled as having enlightened principles, and I desired to be able to meet with the said monarch and have a reasonable discussion face to face. I would have told her that we have had a period of harmony and good relations, so why are you reviving hostilities without justification? You can't read that, but this is what it is. I would get to the bottom of who is right and who is wrong, in the hope of changing her mind and preserving the state structure. At that time, I had already put my own body out of my consideration and had originally wanted to see this through to the end. Unexpectedly, day after day, I was unable to go to the other country and ended up staying here in India for a long time. Why would I want to live like this? All of the food and grain I brought with me here has been used up. How could I face eating foreign food? Time and again, the interpreter brought food to him, but without exception, he rejected it and refused to have any. We repeatedly urged him, but he didn't follow our advice. In the end, on the 29th day of the 2nd month, the 2nd of April, he got ill and could not eat. That's 得病不适 in Chinese. On the 7th day of the 3rd month, the 9th of April, the Xu period, that's between 7 and 9 p.m., he died of the illness, Binggu. As he approached the end, he said no more except that he had let down the emperor's favor and would die full of regrets. Then the report goes back to the trip back to Guangzhou. This excerpt that I've just read you is the ultimate source for the arguments that Ye Mingchen's refusal to commit suicide when he was captured was not from cowardice or some other negative motivation, but was a noble act based on his impression he was being taken to England. As I noted above, this argument runs that in England he intended to speak to Queen Victoria and convince her of her servants' bad behavior in China and get her to reverse their policy. On realizing that this was not going to happen, he decided to starve himself to death, proving, after all, to be a loyal official of the emperor. We should note that this was written some 4 months after Ye's body had been delivered to Guangzhou. In other words, Bi didn't regard informing the emperor of Ye's demise as urgent. Also, Ye's servants say that he stopped eating on the 24th of March, and on April the 2nd, he, quote, got ill and couldn't eat, dying of illness on April the 9th. If we cross-check Alabaster's diary for this period, we find that first, there's no mention at all of Ye's food running out, and nor of his refusal to let his servants buy any more. Don't forget they were living in the same house, right? Secondly, we find him continuing to chat with Alabaster. This is after allegedly he stopped eating. Continuing to chat with Alabaster about various topics, both philosophical and contemporary. Thirdly, on the days before his death, when he was meant to be starving himself to death, Ye is reported to have been willing to take nourishment. An observation backed up by Payne's medical report. So we've got 2 witnesses in Calcutta. Fourthly, at no time in any of Alabaster's diaries or letters, or any of the other letters between British officials in India or Hong Kong, is any mention made of either Ye's desire to go to England, or his willingness to talk about British policy in China, or any wider questions about China's foreign relations. Remember that Alabaster saw Ye daily and read him the British and Indian papers, which were full of reports about the Queen, the British Parliament, and the state of war between Britain and France and China. Also remember that for a good few years when he held office in Canton, he was famous for not wanting to talk to the British. Finally, throughout the memorial, Ye is reported to have died of illness, bingo, and not to have, quote, starved himself to death or, quote, committed suicide, which, after all, there are many fine Chinese words they could have used. I think, therefore, that the evidence we have points to aspects of this memorial being fabricated, probably in an effort to recuperate the reputation of Ye Mingchen, possibly by his family. The simple fact appears to be that Ye Mingchen got sick and died. From where then did the story of Ye starving himself to death derive? In another of the source texts that attempts to recuperate Ye's reputation, Li Fengling's Yin Wu Shuji, we find a reference to Ye adopting a nom de plume while in Calcutta. That name is Haishang Su, or Su of the oceans, or on the ocean, something like that. This name points us to the story of the original Su, an official of the Western Han, who in 100 BCE was sent to the Xiongnu as an ambassador, but was captured. Su tried to commit suicide by the sword, but his life was saved by the Xiongnu, who wanted him as their own advisor. Su refused to be disloyal to the Han and was so imprisoned and starved, but miraculously he survived, and he was then exiled to what is now Lake Baikal and worked as a shepherd until his release was negotiated, returning to the Han 19 years later after he'd been captured. He is thus, as far as Chinese history and illusion is concerned, the epitome of the loyal exile captured while undertaking a foreign mission to the emperor, right? The other allusion here is to the 2 noble brothers, Bo Yi and Shu Qi, who lived in very ancient times, allegedly, over the transition from the Shang to the Zhou. They were known to be extraordinarily filially pious, to such an extent that when the dynasty changed, they refused to eat the food of the new dynasty and therefore starved themselves to death. Remember Ye's alleged words, "How could I face eating foreign food?" Right? So in this memorial, there are allusions to these noble Chinese of the past, etc., etc. Proponents of the theory that Ye Mingchen did indeed starve himself to death not only point to the memorial, but also to 2 poems that Ye Mingchen wrote in Calcutta, one on arrival and one when he knew he was dying. They're often given as evidence that he decided to starve himself to death, and given their importance, I'm just going to talk about them a bit now. sorry, this is going on. I'm not going to talk about the poems themselves. I'm going to do the sinology on them, which I know is boring, but it's important. So the source used for these poems is an essay by the Qing diplomat and writer Xue Fucheng, who died in 1894. This essay, called Grand Councillor Ye of Hanyang and the Catastrophe in Guangzhou, dates from about 1870-something, and it does indeed include the two poems. So this is where most historians have got the poems from. But in a kind of auto-colophon to this essay, Xue remarks that the stories, could you move it on? Sorry, move it on. Oh, no, back. That's it, leave it there. So he records that of his own work, that there are more than 10 works that record these events. Some are excessive in their blame, some are based on hearsay and are unreliable. Only the Cantonese Li Fengling's Yang Wu Xuji and a couple of other works, which I won't mention because they're not relevant, are comparatively judicious. So of those three works, it's only Yang Wu Xuji that's got the poems in it. And if you compare them, they're basically identical. So when you look at Yang Wu Xuji, the context for the poems is given like this. On the 13th day of the first month of the 8th year of the Xianfeng reign period, the barbarian sent Ye Mingchen under guard to the English colony of Bengal, where he lived in the Zhenhai Tower. Military policeman Lan Shoubei and Baba Ding Asan followed Ye and lived in the Zhenhai Tower. At first, when he arrived, he wrote a 7-character regulated verse to express his feelings, but before 10 days had passed, he caught, dysentery and died. The barbarians used an iron coffin to carry his body. Now, I'm not sure what that phrase means. Accompanied by Mercury? I'm not quite sure what the purport of that is. And also handed over the poems he wrote in Canton. And he says, the poem is, and there's the poem. Can we move on? And so after that poem, he then says, when Ye arrived at the Zhenhai Tower, this is the Zhenhai Tower they allege is in Calcutta, a barbarian official came on the 5th day to make an image of him. That's a photograph. This was duly published for barbarian eyes in England, Guangdong, and Shanghai. The next poem is, and there's the next poem. Now, I won't go into detail, but those introductory comments have got a number of important historical inaccuracies in them. It's simply not correct, a lot of what they say. However, I can't go into them deeply here. So now I'm going to rely on an article published in 2013 by a couple of gentlemen from Anhui Shifan Dashi called Ouyang Yuefeng and Wei Jiandong, who've written on this topic. And they note, follow me, please. There is a volume of poems compiled by a man called Sun Yun and published in 1873 called Yu Mo Otan. And in Yu Mo Otan, this Sun Yun guy published a pair of poems that he put under the title Inscribed on the Wall of the Five-Story Tower. The Five-Story Tower is another, there we go. This is Sun Yun's comments. So the Five-Story Tower is another name for the Zhenhai Tower. And at first you can see that in the first volume, Sun Yun says about these two poems, they are anonymous, I don't know what they refer to. I've appended them here so you can appreciate their elusive turn of phrase. He then published a second volume in which he does publish some poems, and at the end of that little section, he writes, in the first volume, I recorded the poems entitled Inscribed on the Wall of the Five-Story Tower. On examination, I now realize they are two of this author's 8 poems on the Blue River, that Sanjiang Bashou. And the author is a man called Li Qiguang, not well known. But if you look at the two poems, the two pairs of poems, that is the ones from the Fengling's book that everybody looks at, and the two in this book, they're almost identical. Can you move on? Here is a comparison of the first one, and then there's a comparison of the second one. What's in yellow are the differences. That's the only differences. And if you can move to the next one, as you can see, also not very greatly different. What becomes clear is that the two pairs of poems, one pair must have copied another pair, right? So either Qu Qiguang copied Li Fenglin, or Li Fenglin copied Qu Qiguang, and they changed a few characters here and there, okay? No other explanation is possible. So, who was Qu Qiguang? Qu Qiguang. Is it possible that we can determine who is the original and who is the later change? Qu Qiguang was a native of Panyu in Guangdong, right? So he's local. He was born in 1827. In 1850, at 23, he was placed second overall in the imperial examination. He got the rank of Bangyan, so he came second in the whole country in the imperial examination. He then had an illustrious career in the bureaucracy, including being a lecturer in the Hanlin Academy. Ouyang and Wei, on the basis of his biography, make the pertinent remark that achieving second place in this examination would have granted Xu such prestige that it's difficult to see why he would need to enhance his reputation at all by taking Ye's poems, altering them slightly, and then publishing them under his own name. If, however, the borrowing went the other way, that is that Li Qiguang wrote the poems and then somebody altered them and said they came from Ye Mingchen, Qu Qiguang would have had to write them before the time of Li Fenglin's Yang Wu Shuji came out, which came out in 1860, very soon after Ye Mingchen had died. However, Ouyang and Wei point out a record they found, very good research, that on the 10th of January 1858, so that's just a handful of days after Ye Mingchen has been captured, the magistrate of Nanhai County, a man called Hua Tingjie, who escaped the city from the foreigners, he then invited a group of graduates to come to meet secretly to organize local militias to fight against the British and the French, right? A little kind of force to attack the invaders. Of the names mentioned, one is Qu Qiguang. Now, Qu Qiguang normally would have been off somewhere in the empire being lecturer at the Hanlin Academy or something, but his mother had died. And so he was doing the 3 years of mourning. So he was back at home in Panyu at this time. And that's why Bai Tingjie was able to come and, get him to join this group. What Ouyang and Wei say, and they do an analysis of the content of the poems as well, which I haven't yet been able to do thoroughly myself. But what they say is that these poems, that Xu's poems are the original ones, that he wrote them after Ye Mingchen had been taken away to India, that those poems were written originally from the point of view of people standing on the Zhenhai Tower in Guangzhou, looking out to sea and having feelings about their former official leader being taken away, perhaps never to return to his country. Their line is that at some time after the poems were written, they were then altered by people, possibly Ye Mingchen's family, to read differently. They maintain these ones now become written from the point of view of Ye Mingchen himself, right? So these ones start with like, oh, look, Ye Mingchen has gone away. This is how I feel. Isn't it terrible? And they change these two to be, oh, look, I have gone away. Isn't it terrible? And so all the allusions that Qu Qiguang makes, and he's after all a Chinese loyalist, about Ye Mingchen being like Bo Yin Shu Qi and being like, Su Wu, are all perfectly sincere on his part, but the poems were changed to recuperate Ye Mingchen's reputation and then found their way into this text in 1860, and the rest is history. I find this argument persuasive. And so the last piece of the puzzle, which I've not been able to do anything about, not been able to find, what I'd really like to find are the original texts of the 8 poems on the Blue River that these 2 poems allegedly came from. Searching has not done any good. I suspect they might have been in manuscript and only find their way into print in the later book from the 1870s. So my very short conclusion is that the 2 sets of evidence that those historians that maintain that Yaming thought he was going to England, wanted to talk to Queen Victoria, when he found out he didn't, he starved himself to death and therefore, etc., was noble, the 2 pieces of evidence that that's based on are not worth anything historically. And that if we look at the other evidence we have, this quite copious evidence from the diary, the medical reports, and so on, it's simply the case that Yaming got an illness and died. And that's where I will finish. Thank you very much.